She didn't recognize the face staring back at her. Spring 1945. Somewhere in the British occupation zone of Germany, a young woman, 23 years old, though she looked 40, stood in the processing area of a prisoner of war camp, holding something she hadn't seen in nearly 3 years. A small hand mirror. The British Red Cross volunteer who had given it to her waited patiently, expecting perhaps a smile, a word of thanks. Instead, the woman's hand began to shake. The mirror slipped from her fingers and shattered on the concrete floor. She wasn't the only one. Across dozens of POW camps established by Allied forces in the final months of World War II, female prisoners encountered mirrors for the first time in years, and the confrontation with their own reflections produced reactions that stunned both the prisoners themselves and their captors. Some women wept uncontrollably. Others stood frozen in silent shock. A few turned away, refusing to look. Many asked, in voices barely above whispers, who that stranger in the glass could possibly be. These were women who had served Nazi Germany in various capacities as military auxiliaries, operating communications equipment and anti-aircraft batteries, as concentration camp guards, who had witnessed and participated in atrocities as clerks and administrators in the vast machinery of the Third Reich. The war had consumed years of their lives. They had endured Allied bombing campaigns that reduced German cities to moonscapes of rubble. They had witnessed the apocalyptic collapse of Hitler's regime. They had been captured, processed, and detained in camps where they confronted the reality of their nation's crimes and their own complicity. But nothing prepared them for the simple act of looking at themselves. The mirror, that most ordinary of objects, that daily companion of peacetime life, became, in this moment, an instrument of profound psychological reckoning. What these women saw reflected back was not merely physical deterioration, though that was shocking enough. They saw the visible evidence of years lived in extremity, of transformation from the young women they remembered being into hardened strangers shaped by war, ideology, and catastrophe. They saw what they had become, and the recognition was devastating. To understand why a mirror could provoke such intense reactions, we must journey back through the experiences that brought these women to this moment. We must explore what war does to human beings, particularly to women, in a totalitarian society that channeled them into militarized roles, and how the absence of ordinary self-reflection, both literal and metaphorical, allowed them to avoid confronting their own transformation until that inevitable moment when avoidance became impossible. This is a story about vanity and its loss, about identity and its dissolution, about the small dignities that anchor us to our humanity and what happens when those anchors are stripped away. It is a story about women who served an evil regime, yes, but also about the universal human experience of confronting who we have become when circumstances push us beyond the boundaries of our imagined selves. It is about the moment when the mirror shows us not who we wish to be, but who we actually are, and the courage or cowardice we display in that encounter. The year 1945 marked not just Germany's military defeat, but the total collapse of the Nazi social order. For women who had found purpose, identity, and meaning within that order, the collapse was both liberation and annihilation. They had lost their nation, their cause, and in many cases their families. But in the POW camps, confronted with mirrors, they discovered they had also lost something more fundamental and more difficult to articulate. They had lost themselves. To understand the women who would become prisoners in 1945, we must first understand the unprecedented mobilization of German women for the Nazi war. A mobilization that transformed their lives, their identities, and ultimately their very appearances in ways they could not recognize until it was too late. When Adolf Hitler launched his war of conquest in September 1939, Nazi ideology officially maintained that women's proper sphere was Kinder, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, but ideology bowed to military necessity. As the war expanded and consumed millions of German men, women were systematically recruited into supporting roles that freed men for frontline combat. By 1945, over 500,000 German women served in military auxiliary services. The largest organization was Die Nachrichtenhilfe. These Eres female communications helpers of the army who operated telephone switchboards, telegraphs, and radio equipment. These women wore uniforms, lived in barracks, and followed military discipline. They were not officially soldiers, but their roles were militarized. and their lives were structured by military routine. The Luftwaffe employed 130,000 women as Luftwaffenhelfen Air Force auxiliaries who operated and assisted with anti-aircraft batteries defending German cities. These young women, often teenagers, found themselves on the literal front lines as Allied strategic bombing intensified from 1943 onward. They worked through night raids, witnessing the firestorms that consumed Hamburg, the destruction of Berlin, the obliteration of Dresden. They saw cities burn and bodies pulled from rubble. Many were killed or wounded at their posts. The Kriegsmarine had its female auxiliaries. The SS employed women in administrative and guard functions across occupied Europe. German women worked in military administration, logistics, communications, and support services. The total mobilization Hitler had initially resisted became absolute necessity as Germany's military situation deteriorated. This militarization transformed these women's daily existence in ways both obvious and subtle. The military auxiliaries rose before dawn for roll call. They worked long shifts, often 12 to 16 hours, as the war situation worsened. They wore uniforms that erased individual fashion and imposed collective identity. Their hair was cut short or pinned up under caps for practicality. They had no time or resources for cosmetics, for attention to appearance, for the small rituals of feminine self-care that had marked peacetime life. More fundamentally, they had no mirrors. Military barracks were Spartan. Personal items were minimal. In a society mobilized for total war, where resources were desperately scarce, mirrors were not priorities. The women washed their faces in communal basins, combed their hair by feel or with help from roommates, and went about their duties without regular confrontation with their own reflections. This absence was not merely practical, it was psychological. Without mirrors, these women lost regular feedback about their own transformation. They couldn't see themselves aging prematurely under stress. They couldn't observe their faces hardening, their eyes developing the 1,000-yard stare that comes from witnessing horror, their bodies thinning as rations diminished. They existed in a state of physical self-ignorance, knowing themselves only through the reactions of others and their own internal sense of identity. For the approximately 3,500 women who served as concentration camp guards, the absence of mirrors took on darker significance. These women, the Aufseherinnen, worked in an environment of systematic cruelty that would have been difficult to reconcile with any self-image as decent human beings. They oversaw prisoners in camps like Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz. Some were sadistic volunteers who relished their power. Others convinced themselves they were simply doing necessary wartime work, following orders, maintaining discipline. Without mirrors, these women could avoid seeing what their actions were making them into. They could maintain internal narratives about themselves that might not have survived regular confrontation with their own reflections. How do you look yourself in the eye after selecting prisoners for gas chambers? How do you see yourself after beating women until they collapse? The absence of mirrors allowed a form of psychological compartmentalization. The work was separate from the self, or so they could tell themselves. As the war ground on, the physical deterioration of these women accelerated. By 1944, Germany's situation had become desperate. Allied bombing destroyed infrastructure, disrupted food distribution, and created shortages of everything from medical supplies to soap. Women in military service, like everyone in Germany, felt these deprivations acutely. Rations diminished steadily. By late 1944, auxiliary women received about 1,800 calories per day, technically adequate for survival, but insufficient for those doing physically demanding work under high stress. The food was monotonous. Black bread, thin soup, occasional potatoes, rarely meat. Vitamin deficiencies became common. Women's menstrual cycles became irregular or stopped entirely, a physiological response to malnutrition and stress. The work itself was exhausting. As Germany's military position collapsed, those who kept the communications network functioning or manned the anti-aircraft defenses worked ever longer hours. The Luftwaffe auxiliaries in particular endured conditions of extraordinary stress: nightly air raids, constant danger, inadequate shelter, and the psychological trauma of watching their cities destroyed. Sleep became a luxury. Women in the communications service might work 18-hour shifts when military operations intensified. Those manning searchlights and anti-aircraft positions worked through the night, then tried to sleep during the debut. Allied daylight raids made even that impossible. Chronic sleep deprivation became the norm. It aged them, hollowed their faces, and put a haunted quality in their eyes. Hygiene deteriorated as soap. Hot water and basic sanitation became scarce. Women's skin became rough, their hair dull and brittle. Dental care was non-existent. Minor health problems, skin conditions, infections, digestive issues went untreated and became chronic. The accumulated effect was rapid aging. 20-year-old women began to look 30. 30-year-olds looked 50. But without mirrors, they remained largely unaware of these changes. They felt exhausted, yes. They knew their uniforms hung looser as they lost weight. They were aware of aching joints and constant fatigue, but they couldn't see the transformation written on their face, the new lines around their eyes, the gray hair appearing prematurely, the sunken cheeks and hollow stares. Their self-image remained frozen at some earlier point. The young women they had been when they volunteered or were conscripted, when the war still seemed winnable, when they still believed in the Führer's promises and the righteousness of Germany's cause. This internal self-image had no opportunity to update itself based on external reality, because that external reality was never reflected back to them. The psychological toll was perhaps even more significant than the physical. These women absorbed years of trauma. They witnessed death from Allied bombing, from military casualties, from the systematic murder in concentration camps. They lived in constant fear of air raids, of military police, of the consequences of defeat. They endured the cognitive dissonance of serving a regime whose promises of victory rang increasingly hollow as the front lines collapsed. Nazi ideology had promised these women that their service was noble, that they were contributing to a glorious national rebirth, that the suffering would be vindicated by victory. As defeat became undeniable, that ideological framework crumbled. But without time or space for reflection, the women simply endured, day by day, maintaining their routines and their duties, even as the world collapsed around them. For the concentration camp guards, the psychological burden was of a different order entirely. They had participated in or witnessed atrocities on a scale difficult for the human mind to process. Psychological research on perpetrators of mass violence has shown that such participation requires various mental mechanisms: dehumanization of victims, obedience to authority, diffusion of responsibility, and ideological justification. But it also requires a kind of self-alienation, a separation of one's actions from one's self-concept. As a moral person, the spring of 1945 brought catastrophic collapse. Soviet forces smashed through eastern Prussia and drove toward Berlin. British and American armies crossed the Rhine and swept through western Germany. The Wehrmacht disintegrated. Cities fell with barely a fight. The infrastructure of Nazi governance, so meticulously organized, so brutally efficient, simply ceased to function. For the women in military auxiliary services, the collapse came with bewildering speed. Communications networks that had functioned with precision for years suddenly went dark. Orders became contradictory or simply stopped coming. Officers disappeared. Some auxiliary units received instructions to evacuate eastward, away from the advancing Western Allies, and toward the Soviet forces, a move that terrified women who had heard stories of Red Army atrocities. Other units were abandoned entirely, left to fend for themselves as military command structure evaporated. The Luftwaffe auxiliaries manning anti-aircraft positions found themselves with no ammunition, no orders, and no enemy bombers to fight. The Allies had achieved complete air superiority and bombing had ceased as ground forces occupied German territory. These young women, who had spent years scanning the skies for enemy aircraft, now watched those same aircraft flying unchallenged overhead, dropping leaflets that announced Germany's imminent defeat and promised fair treatment to those who surrendered. In the chaos, many women simply removed their uniforms and tried to disappear into civilian populations. They buried their papers, changed into civilian clothes scrounged from abandoned homes, and attempted to blend in with the millions of refugees, clogging roads and hiding in ruins. But Allied authorities were systematic about screening populations. Military-age women were questioned. Those who had served in uniform were identified through documentation, through testimony from others, through their own admissions. The concentration camp guards faced different circumstances. As Allied forces approached the camps, SS authorities attempted to evacuate prisoners on death marches. trying to hide evidence of their crimes. The female guards were ordered to accompany these marshes, continuing to terrorize prisoners, even as the Reich collapsed around them. Many guards fled instead, trying to escape justice. But the liberation of camps in April and May 1945 brought their crimes into sharp focus. Survivors identified guards. Allied military police arrested them. Some guards were caught immediately. Others were tracked down in the weeks and months following liberation. The moment of capture varied greatly, depending on circumstances. Some women were taken into custody by British or American forces during organized surrenders of military units. Talinet App were disarmed if they carried weapons, and were marched under guard to temporary holding areas. The process was formal, bureaucratic, almost anticlimactic after the chaos that had preceded it. Others were arrested, individually pulled from refugee columns, identified in screening processes, or caught trying to hide. Some resisted verbally, insisting they had done nothing wrong, that they were merely following orders, that they were victims themselves. Others went silently, too exhausted or traumatized to protest. The journey to POW camps was itself another ordeal. Women were transported in military trucks, often open to the elements, along roads choked with refugees and military traffic. The trips could take hours or days. They received minimal food and water. They had no information about where they were being taken or what would happen to them. Many expected summary execution. They had absorbed enough Nazi propaganda about Allied brutality to believe they would be killed. What they found instead was bureaucracy. Allied authorities, particularly the British and Americans, were committed to processing prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. This required documentation, classification, and organization. It meant temporary holding camps, then transfer to more permanent facilities. It meant medical screening, interrogation, assignment to work details, and establishment of camp routines. Through all of this, the collapse, the flight, the capture, the transport, the processing, these women had no access to mirrors. They washed when they could, usually in cold water from communal pumps or basins. They tried to maintain some basic hygiene despite the chaos, but they had no way to see themselves, no feedback about how the experience was marking them. They were aware of their deterioration in abstract ways. Their clothes hung loose from weight loss. Their boots hurt because their feet were swollen from poor nutrition and constant standing. Their hands were rough and cracked, but these were peripheral observations, not integrated into any coherent self-image. The POW camps established by British and American forces for German women operated according to international law, but they were nevertheless places of confinement, deprivation, and uncertainty. For women who arrived expecting brutality similar to Nazi camps, the reality was disorienting. The treatment was humane by Geneva Convention standards, yet they remained prisoners in a defeated nation, facing an unknown future. The camps varied in size and quality. Some held several thousand women in large compounds with multiple barracks, recreation yards, administrative buildings, and perimeter fences topped with barbed wire. Others were smaller facilities that had been converted from existing structures, old factories, schools, or military installations. All shared certain characteristics. They were crowded, basic, and Spartan. Daily life in the camps followed strict routines. Wake-up came at dawn with roll call. All prisoners stood outside their barracks to be counted a security measure to prevent escapes. Then came breakfast. Typically black bread, margarine, and weak coffee or tea. The food was adequate to prevent starvation. Geneva Conventions required that prisoners receive rations comparable to depot troops, but it was monotonous and often insufficient for women who had already endured years of malnutrition. After breakfast came work assignments. Prisoners were required to perform labor under Geneva Convention rules, but only non-military labor. Women worked in camp kitchens, laundries, and maintenance. They cleaned barracks, tended small vegetable gardens, and performed administrative tasks. The work was not brutal, but it was mandatory, and it filled long hours that might otherwise have been consumed by despair and rumination. Afternoons brought more work, or, for those who had completed their assignments, free time in the camp yards. This was when women could socialize, write letters, which were censored but permitted, or simply rest. Some camps had small libraries with German books. A few offered educational classes, basic literacy, arithmetic, or vocational skills. The physical conditions varied, but were generally Spartan. Women slept in barracks on metal frame beds, with thin mattresses and rough blankets. Privacy was non-existent. 40 or 50 women might share a single long room. Washrooms were communal, with rows of sinks and toilets. Hot water was scarce. Soap was rationed. Sanitary supplies for menstruation were minimal, and there were no mirrors. Camp authorities provided the absolute minimum of personal items. Prisoners received basic toiletries: a bar of soap, a comb, a toothbrush, if available. But mirrors were considered non-essential. The washrooms had metal surfaces that might show the vaguest distorted reflection, but nothing that allowed clear self-examination. This absence was partly practical. Mirrors could be broken, and the shards used as weapons, or for self. But it also reflected the low priority given to prisoners' appearance or vanity. This was a detention facility, not a hotel. Comfort and personal grooming aids were luxuries that defeated enemies did not merit. The psychological atmosphere in the camps was complex and often toxic. Women were housed with others who had served in various capacities, creating a mixture of Wehrmacht auxiliaries, Luftwaffe, personnel, and in some cases, concentration camp guards awaiting trial. Hierarchies and tensions emerged. Some women remained ideologically committed to Nazism and looked down on those who expressed doubts. Others began questioning everything they had believed. Arguments erupted. Factions formed. The Camp Guards, British or American military police, often with female officers overseeing female prisoners, maintained order, but did not engage in the systematic cruelty that characterized Nazi camps. Prisoners who broke rules faced punishment, loss of privileges, solitary confinement for serious offenses, or extension of detention. But there were no beatings, no starvation, no arbitrary killings. The contrast with what many prisoners knew about Nazi camp operations was stark. Without mirrors, the women in POW camps continued to transform in ways they could feel but not see. The stress of captivity, the uncertain future, the gradual confrontation with their nation's crimes, of this left marks that went unobserved, because there was no way to observe them. The physical changes continued. While POW camp rations prevented outright starvation, they were insufficient for full health. Women remained thin, their bodies consuming their own reserves. Hair continued to thin and gray. Skin remained rough and prematurely aged from years of inadequate nutrition and care. Teeth loosened or developed cavities that went untreated. Small wounds healed slowly or became infected. But the psychological changes were perhaps more profound. Living in captivity forces a confrontation with powerlessness. These women, who had once been part of a vast military machine, now had no control over their daily existence. They ate what they were given, worked when told to work, and waited for decisions made by others about their fate. This learned helplessness left its own mocker resignation visible in posture, in expression, and the loss of the energetic purposefulness that had once characterized their service. Allied authorities implemented re-education programs in the camps. German prisoners were shown documentary films of concentration camp, liberation footage of mass graves, gas chambers, emaciated survivors. They were lectured about Nazi crimes and Germany's responsibility. They were given reading materials about democracy and human rights. The reactions varied wildly. Some women were genuinely shocked, claiming they had known nothing about the extermination camps. Others insisted the footage was propaganda, that it had been fabricated by the Allies. A few, particularly former concentration camp guards, sat through the screenings with blank faces, neither confirming nor denying what they had witnessed or done. But for many, the re-education programs triggered a psychological crisis. The cognitive dissonance between their self-concept as decent people who had served their country and the reality of what that country had done became unbearable. Some women suffered mental breakdowns. Others retreated into denial. A few began the painful process of genuine moral reckoning. All of this, the physical deterioration, the psychological trauma, the ideological collapse, was written on their faces and bodies. But without mirrors, they remained unaware of how visible their transformation had become. They knew they felt different, that something fundamental had changed, but they couldn't see it reflected back to them. The absence of mirrors in the camps was both a deprivation and, in a strange way, a mercy. It allowed these women to avoid confronting the full extent of what war and ideology had made them into. They could maintain some internal sense of continuity with their former selves. They could imagine that when they were released, if they were released, they would somehow return to being the women they remembered being before the war. The decision to provide mirrors to female POWs came from an unexpected source. Red Cross relief workers and allied welfare organizations who were bringing humanitarian supplies into the camps. By summer 1945, with the immediate crisis of war's end subsiding, these organizations began efforts to improve conditions for prisoners, not just German POWs, but displaced persons, refugees, and survivors of Nazi camps who were being housed in other facilities. The Red Cross workers, many of them women, observed conditions in the POW camps and noted the absence of basic personal items that would be considered essential for women's dignity. They lobbied camp authorities to allow distribution of care packages containing toiletries, sanitary supplies, and small personal items. Among these items were inexpensive hand mirrors. Camp commandants approved the distributions, seeing no harm in providing such basic items. Some actively supported it, recognizing that improving prisoner morale would reduce tensions and make camp management easier. The security concern about mirrors being broken and used as weapons was addressed by providing mirrors, with the glass recessed into frames or backed with thick materials that prevented easy shattering. The distributions occurred over several weeks in summer 1945, varying by camp. Red Cross workers would arrive with crates of supplies. Camp authorities would announce that personal care packages were being distributed. Women would line up, present their prisoner identification, and receive a small bundle containing soap, a comb, perhaps a toothbrush, occasionally some cream for chapped hands, and a small mirror. The workers who distributed these packages expected gratitude. They were, after all, providing comfort items that would improve daily life. They anticipated perhaps tears of relief, certainly thanks, maybe requests for additional items. What they did not anticipate was the reaction that actually occurred. The first distributions produced scenes that astonished everyone present. Women would take their packages back to their barracks or find a quiet corner of the compound. They would open the bundles, examine the contents, and discover the mirror, and then silo shock. Sometimes screams, often tears, sometimes a complete withdrawal. And to cut it, one Red Cross worker, Sarah Mitchell from Manchester, recorded in her diary, "We distributed the care packages today. I thought it would lift their spirits. Instead, many of the women seemed devastated. One young woman, she couldn't have been more than 25, looked in the mirror and began weeping so violently that the camp medical staff had to sedate her. I don't understand what we've done wrong." Camp authorities initially thought the mirrors were defective somehow, that perhaps distortions in the glass were creating disturbing reflections. But examination showed the mirrors were normal, inexpensive, but functional. The problem was not with the mirrors, but with what they revealed. What these women saw when they looked at their reflections was not what they expected to see. That internal self-image frozen at some earlier point, never updated because they had never seen themselves collided with the reality of what they had become. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, older, harder, more worn than the woman they remembered being. The disconnect was profound and traumatic. The responses to receiving mirrors revealed the complex psychology of self-regret and the diverse ways individual women processed their experiences of war, defeat, and captivity. Camp medical officers and guards documented reactions that ranged from emotional breakdown to violent rejection to silent withdrawal. Some women simply refused to look. They accepted the care packages, discovered the mirror, and immediately gave it away or hid it under their bedding without ever raising it to their face. For these women, avoidance was the only viable coping mechanism. They sensed, perhaps unconsciously, that self-confrontation would be unbearable. Better to remain in ignorance than to see what they had become. Others looked briefly, then quickly looked away, visibly shaken. These women had caught a glimpse of themselves and found the image too distressing to sustain. They might try again later, in private, for longer examinations. But the initial encounter was too shocking for extended viewing. Many women wept upon seeing themselves. These tears had multiple sources. Some cried from simple grief at their physical deterioration, the lost youth, the premature aging, The visible toll of years lived in extremity. They mourned their lost beauty, their lost health, their lost sense of themselves as attractive or vital beings. But others cried from deeper, more complex emotions. For women who had begun to recognize their complicity in Nazi crimes, the face in the mirror was that of a person they could no longer respect. They saw not just physical deterioration, but moral corruption written in their features. The hard eyes, the tight mouth, the expression that had become habitual during years of service to an evil regime. Of this was suddenly visible and undeniable. Former concentration camp guards had particularly intense reactions. These women had participated in atrocities, and now they saw the faces of those who had done such things. Some experienced this as revelation. So this is what a person who did those things looks like. The ordinariness of their own appearance became disturbing. They were not monsters with visible markers of evil. They were simply women, aging and worn, who had done monstrous things. A few women reacted with anger. They blamed the Red Cross workers for providing the mirrors, accused camp authorities of deliberately trying to demoralize them, and insisted that their appearance was the result of Allied mistreatment rather than the consequences of their own choices and actions. This defensive rage was itself a form of psychological protection against unbearable self-recognition. Some women became obsessed with their appearance after the initial shock. They studied their reflections constantly, cataloging every line, every gray hair, every mark of their transformation. This obsessive examination was a form of processing, trying to integrate their current reality with their remembered self-image. Through repeated viewing, they attempted to accept and internalize what they had become. Others used the mirror as motivation for self-improvement. They began paying more attention to grooming, even with limited resources. They combed their hair more carefully, washed more thoroughly, tried to restore some sense of personal dignity through whatever small improvements they could manage. The mirror became a tool for reconstructing a sense of self-control in an environment where they controlled almost nothing. Younger prisoners often reacted with particular distress. Women who had been teenagers when the war began and were only in their early 20s by 1945 looked in the mirror and saw faces that appeared 10 or 15 years older. The theft of their youth was visible and irrevocable. They had entered service as girls and emerged as prematurely aged women, and the evidence was undeniable in their reflections. Camp counselors and medical personnel found themselves dealing with an unexpected mental health crisis. Women were experiencing acute psychological distress, triggered by something as simple as a hand mirror. Some required sedation. Others needed extended counseling. A few attempted self-harm, not with the mirrors themselves, which had been designed to prevent that, but through other means. The mirror crisis in the POW camps caught the attention of Allied psychological warfare specialists and military psychiatrists who recognized they were witnessing something psychologically significant. Several doctors began documenting and analyzing the phenomenon, contributing to what would eventually become important research on trauma, identity, and self-concept. The human relationship with mirrors is deeply psychological. Mirrors provide literal self-reflection, but they also serve metaphorical functions. We use mirrors to maintain our sense of identity, to confirm that we exist as coherent beings, to monitor our presentation to the social world. Regular access to mirrors is part of how we construct and maintain self. When that access is removed for extended periods, as it was for these women during years of war, Savista internal self-image becomes frozen. It no longer updates based on external feedback. The person retains a mental picture of themselves that is increasingly divorced from reality. This disconnect remains largely unconscious as long as the person has no way to see themselves. The reintroduction of mirrors forces a sudden, traumatic updating of self-concept. The person must reconcile their internal image with external reality all at once, rather than through the gradual process that normally occurs with regular mirror use. The psychological term for this is self-recognition shock, the distress that occurs when our internal self-concept collides with undeniable external evidence that we are not who we thought we were. For the female POWs, this shock was compounded by multiple factors. They had not just aged normally, they had undergone extreme physical and psychological transformation under conditions of stress, malnutrition, and trauma. The person in the mirror was not slightly older or more tired. She was fundamentally different, marked by experiences that had altered her at the deepest levels. The shock was also moral and ideological. These women had served a regime that had been exposed as monstrous. They lived in camps where they were shown evidence of Holocaust atrocities. Even those who tried to maintain denial were surrounded by the undeniable fact of Germany. This defeat in the collapse of everything Nazi ideology had promised, looking in the mirror became, for many, a moment of moral reckoning. They saw not just physical transformation but the visible evidence of their choices. The face in the mirror was the face of someone who had made those choices, served that regime, participated in or tolerated those crimes. Self-recognition became inseparable from moral recognition. Psychologists working in the camps noted that the women who handled the mirror encounter most adaptively were those who had already begun processing their experiences through other means. Women who had written in journals, talked extensively with fellow prisoners, or engaged genuinely with re-education programs were better equipped to integrate their physical transformation into an evolving self-concept. They had already begun the work of confronting who they had become. The mirror simply confirmed what they had already begun to accept. Conversely, women who had avoided all self-examination, who had maintained ideological rigidity, refused to engage with evidence of Nazi crimes, or retreated into denial suffered the most severe reactions to mirrors. For them, the mirror shattered carefully maintained illusions all at once, creating psychological crises that were difficult to resolve. The mirror phenomenon also revealed gender-specific aspects of wartime trauma. While male prisoners also underwent physical transformation during war, the cultural expectations around female appearance made the transformation more psychologically fraught for women. Nazi ideology had emphasized women's roles as mothers and wives, maintaining specific ideals of feminine beauty and domestic virtue. The women who looked in mirrors and saw hardened, prematurely aged faces confronted not just personal deterioration, but the failure to embody the ideals they had been taught to value. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, the initial mirror crisis in the POW camps gradually resolved into something more complex and ultimately more human. A slow process of acceptance, reconstruction, and, for some, genuine transformation that would shape the rest of these women's lives. The mirrors, once distributed, could not be taken back. Women who had initially refused to look eventually did so. Those who had been traumatized by the first viewing gradually became accustomed to their reflections. The psychological shock wore off, replaced by the steady work of integrating a new self-concept that matched external reality. Camp routines continued, but with subtle changes. Women began paying more attention to their appearance within the limited means available. They braided each other's hair. They used scraps of fabric to create small improvements to their uniforms. They saved bits of soap to wash more thoroughly. These were not acts of vanity in any conventional sense. They were efforts to reclaim some dignity, some sense of self-worth, some evidence that they remained human beings capable of self-care despite their circumstances. The mirrors also became social tools. Women gathered to look at themselves together, offering mutual support and reassurance. We all look terrible, but at least we look terrible together, became a form of dark humor that built solidarity. Shared suffering, visible in their reflected faces, created bonds of understanding that transcended the ideological divisions that had initially fractured campo populations. As Allied authorities began processing prisoners for release, a gradual process that would extend into 1946 and beyond, the mirrors took on new significance. Women preparing to return to civilian life used mirrors to assess how they would appear to family members and communities they had seen in years. The mirror became a tool for imagining re-entry into a world that had moved on without them. But returning to that world was complicated by what the mirror revealed. Many women had families who had no idea what they had been through. How do you explain to a husband or parents that you are no longer the person they remember? How do you return home when the face you bring with you is a stranger's face, bearing witness to experiences you cannot fully articulate? Some women were released to discover that home no longer existed. Their cities had been bombed into rubble. Family members were dead, missing, or scattered as refugees. In these cases, the face in the mirror became one of the few continuities they possessed. The physical proof that they had survived, even if deeply changed. For former concentration camp guards, the mirrors carried a different burden. Those convicted of war crimes faced imprisonment or execution. Those who escaped prosecution often lived in fear of later identification and arrest. The face in the mirror was evidence it had aged in ways that made them less recognizable, but it remained the face that survivors might identify, that old photographs might betray. Some women who escaped justice deliberately altered their appearance, dyed their hair, changed their styles, trying to become even more different from the women they had been. The psychological literature that emerged from studying the mirror phenomenon would eventually contribute to therapeutic approaches for trauma survivors, Holocaust perpetrators, and others who had undergone profound identity disruption. The recognition that self-concept requires regular updating through external feedback, and that the absence of such feedback can create dangerous disconnects between internal image and external reality, influenced treatment protocols for prisoners of war, hostages, and others held in conditions of isolation. But the most important legacy of the mirror crisis was perhaps the most simple. It reminded both the women who experienced it and those who witnessed it that identity is not fixed, that circumstances can transform us beyond recognition, and that confronting who we have become, truly seeing ourselves, requires courage that not everyone possesses. Decades later, in interviews conducted for historical archives, survivors of the POW camps would return to that moment when they first looked in a mirror after years without one. They described it universally as one of the most significant moments of their lives, more vivid in memory than their capture, more emotionally intense than their release, more psychologically important than many of the events of the war itself. One woman, Greta Hoffmann, interviewed in 1987 at age 6, said, "I was 23 when I looked in that mirror, but I looked 40. I had served in the Luftwaffe auxiliaries, spent years at an anti-aircraft battery, witnessed my city bombed to ruins, been captured and held for months, but I wasn't ready to see what all that had done to me. The mirror forced me to see. And once I saw, I couldn't unsee. I couldn't go back to thinking of myself as the girl I had been. I had to accept the woman I had become, for better and worse." Another, Marguerite Klein, who had worked in concentration camp administration and served time for war crimes, reflected in a 1995 interview, "I deserved worse than what I got. Know that, at that moment, with the mirror seeing the face of someone who had been part of what happened in those camps, that was a reckoning I could unescape. I looked exactly like what I was, and I've lived every day since with that face, and the knowledge of what the person who had that face had done. The story of female POWs rendered speechless by mirrors is ultimately a story about the inescapability of truth. These women could avoid self-examination for years. They could maintain illusions about who they were and what they had done. They could operate within ideological frameworks that justified or minimized their actions, but they could not ultimately avoid seeing themselves, literally and metaphorically. The mirror was simply a tool, an ordinary object that normally serves mundane purposes. But in that historical moment, for those particular women, it became something more. An instrument of truth, a catalyst for reckoning, a portal through which the self could no longer hide from itself. We live now in an age of constant self-reflection. Cameras are everywhere. We see ourselves in photographs and videos daily. We curate our images on social media. We are hyper-aware of how we appear to others. It is nearly impossible to go years without seeing our own reflections. But the story of those POW camp mirrors reminds us that this was not always so, and that the ability to see ourselves clearly, both literally and metaphorically, is a kind of freedom we should not take for granted. More importantly, it reminds us that truth, however painful, cannot be avoided forever. Eventually, we must all look in the mirror. Eventually, we must all confront who we have become. The women who stood speechless before their reflections in 1945 were experiencing the inevitable moment of recognition that comes to everyone who has undergone profound transformation. They had been changed by war, by ideology, by choices they made and circumstances they endured. The mirror simply showed them what had already happened. It made the invisible visible. It forced recognition of reality they had been able to avoid as long as avoidance was possible. Some of these women found, in that recognition, the beginning of genuine transformation, not the transformation imposed by war, but the transformation chosen through moral courage and honest self-examination. Others never recovered from the shock, living the rest of their lives as people haunted by the stranger they saw that day in the mirror. The mirrors themselves were ordinary objects, cheaply made, distributed as minor comfort items by well-meaning aid workers. Most were eventually lost, broken, or discarded as the camps closed and prisoners returned to civilian life. But the moment they enabled that instant of profound self-recognition echoes through history as a reminder that we cannot forever avoid seeing ourselves as we truly are. In the end, the mirror shows us only what is already there. But sometimes, what is already there is something we have spent years trying not to see. And when we finally truly look, we discover that we cannot be the same after seeing. We can only move forward, carrying the knowledge of who we have become, and making choices about who we will be from this moment on. The women who wept before mirrors in those POW camps in 1945 were grieving many things. Lost youth, lost beauty, lost innocence, lost years. But more than anything, they were grieving the loss of illusion, the comforting fiction that they were still the women they remembered, being that the war had not fundamentally changed them, that they could somehow return to who they were before. The mirror told them otherwise, and in telling them, it gave them something precious, despite the pain. It gave them truth. What they did with that truth, whether they used it as foundation for genuine moral reckoning, or whether they turned away from it into continued denial, varied from woman to woman. But they could never again claim ignorance of who they had become. The stranger in the mirror was themselves, and that recognition, however painful, was the first step toward whatever healing or continued suffering their futures would bring.